Well, hello and welcome to the latest episode of the AI Guides podcast. As always, I'm with my colleague Jen. Jen, say hi.
Hello.
And today our guest is Briana Brownell from Pure Strategy. Hi, Briana.
Hello, great to be here.
Excellent. We're really happy to have you here. So, on this podcast, we talk about the democratization of AI and how businesses that might not have been able to use it even a few years ago are starting to use it. And so just with that background, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, or your story, and why did you start your business?
So I love that. I love the idea that we're finally in a place with some of these new AI tools that anyone can use them. For such a long time, it was so challenging to be able to build anything from, any kind of language modeling was really challenging technically, but now it's really accessible. So, my story is really about coming out of sort of the data science area, working with companies, trying to sort of gain insight on things like customer behavior, understanding their market, and really just sort of being able to give some evidence so that they could make better decisions. And when I started my company, Pure Strategy, what I really saw was the opportunity that some of these new machine learning and AI tools brought to the companies. So I have been sort of using a lot of the new tools that have come out to do, faster, better, more in-depth data analysis, and then also integrating some of that within sort of company systems.
That's great. That leads me very nicely into my question for you, which is I'd really love to hear more about both the sorts of projects you work on. You've already mentioned that a little bit, but also if there's any particular specializations you have in terms of the projects that you do.
So a lot of it is really about being able to use some of the more cutting edge tools and then integrating them into sort of technology systems. So an example is using some of the large language models before GPT-4 and ChatGPT to do things like detect emotion in text and being able to have that analysis within the technology system that sort of integrates and then can sort of give you additional insight, using these tools. So a lot of it is around the sort of integration aspect and trying to figure out what's possible, because that's the other challenging thing in AI is there's so many tools and so many possibilities that how do you figure out what's possible? How do
Mhm.
you figure out what kinds of things you can actually usefully integrate into a system, right? And so I work with clients on figuring those big questions out and then also, figuring out how to actually do the integration within the technology.
Absolutely.
Is there some industries that you tend to work with, or what does a typical customer for you look like?
So I work with a lot of tech companies actually. So a lot of times they have a fairly good basis of how they're going to design and build their product, but they know that the machine learning and AI framework is something that they don't necessarily have enough knowledge on their team to be able to figure out how to build that into their system. And so I can help them either with building the models. I can help them with figuring out what kinds of models might even be relevant to their business, right? And then helping sort of do that handoff with their staff to make sure that it's working and then figure out sort of the actual system around it. The other thing, which is totally on the opposite end, are organizations that are really just kind of getting started with their data analysis. They know that they have lots of data. They don't really know how they can use it, and they want someone to basically come in and look at it and say, here are a range of possibilities that could really help you.
That's cool. So you're like their virtual chief AI officer?
That's a great way to put it. Yes.
Super. Okay, so obviously generative AI, Chat GPT, we're now up to four, right? Even grandmothers know about this and are talking about it on the bus. So if it's affecting everyone, I'm just curious, how's it affecting you?
So I love ChatGPT. I might be addicted, in fact, to ChatGPT because I have used it for everything, right? And I think that the real power of having a tool like this is that as soon as you can really figure out how to make it work for you, so you can do things so quickly, right? Things that I've been putting off for like months or years, all of a sudden these things seem possible now, right? With ChatGPT. So for me, being able to do some of the generative text, I think is like amazing, helping me, write emails, summarize things, all of that I think is really great. But also the creative aspect, being able to ideate with it. I love that. I'm working on a few sort of creative projects where I've used it to help me come up with ideas, refine my ideas, and that works really well because it's sort of like a rubber duck that actually talks back to you, right? And I know all the coders are familiar with rubber ducking, but it's the perfect format to do something like that with.
Yeah, that's great. And I will say, for those of you who aren't familiar with the whole rubber duck thing, it's a thing in programming where if you can't get your program to work, you're supposed to talk to a rubber duck or a plant. And it really does help you to figure out what you need to do next. And so that's a great idea to use
Yeah.
ChatGPT for that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm super excited actually of what it can do for coding though, too. So I think I did an experiment over the weekend to see how far I could getting ChatGPT to create a working demo for an app that I'm really working on. And I found it fascinating because there were some areas that I thought it worked really, really well. I got it working eventually, but I really do think that the way that people program is going to be just completely changed as a result of these tools.
Yeah, there's emergent capabilities that people were not even anticipating, right? One of the things we've been seeing is companies they're really excited about it, and they're loving ChatGPT as sort of this all-purpose smarty pants, which is working great. But they also want to be able to have kind of their own version of it that is really attached to their own knowledge base, as opposed to being more sort of general. And what are your thoughts about that, sort of turning these large language models towards specific domains, specific knowledge bases?
So we actually probably, I don't know, it was like 6 or 7 years ago when we started working with a lot of companies in the healthcare space because we were creating language models back then. They weren't nearly as big or as, comprehensive as GPT-3 and all of those kinds of models. But we found that you essentially had to do the same kind of thing. So you would create a general purpose language model, and then you would need to find data to fine tune it for that specific domain. So in healthcare, there are all kinds of terms, for example, that have different meanings within the healthcare context, right? So for example, tab, so, means like a pill or like a capsule, right? And so that in general language, like it wouldn't necessarily be caught, but then when you fine tuned it, then the language model would kind of understand that it's related to, a pill and it meant a treatment dose, right? And so I've seen that work incredibly well. And I think that this is going to be an extremely useful thing for companies, but it does depend on making sure that you have well structured, well kept, well maintained data systems, because otherwise, it's going to be extremely challenging to be able to train a model on anything if you don't have that already set up. So I think it's going to force companies to invest in some of that infrastructure, which I think is good, actually.
Yeah. We sometimes talk about AI being the shiny thing that will motivate people. And, you get to say, hey, if you want the shiny AI engine, you need to have the good fuel. This is what you need to do. Yeah.
I love that.
So we colleagues who work in law, for example, and they're wondering, if they work in a specific domain like intellectual property or patents, and they have all of this case history, and they're wondering, could they turn something like ChatGPT to train it on its data to answer their questions to their junior lawyers about how should we be pushing a client like this? Do you think that's something that's feasible for a law firm to even consider?
So I don't know much about law, but just from what I've seen on how well the language models can sort of understand things within specific domains, I think that there's a possibility that it could get you to a certain place. However, the challenge is always that the models don't know fact from fiction. They really just know probabilities, right? And so to be certain, you really do need to actually invest that time to fact check, the work that ChatGPT or whatever model that you're sort of fine tuning churns out, right? So then if you're a lawyer, your fundamental tasks at your job really changes, right? So instead of you reviewing it and sort of creating, synthesizing that analysis, you're essentially reading someone else's analysis and then validating whether or not that's true. And in some ways, that actually forces you to think about it in a more sophisticated way because you're checking now, you have to say, is there evidence? Is this true? Right. And so when you're creating it yourself, you have all of these personal biases, right? You can't really fact check yourself, can you?
No.
So this kind of makes it really interesting because all of a sudden you might have the case where having somebody check chat GPT that's fine-tuned actually is less biased than somebody creating it themselves.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of it like that. Jen, anything else you want to talk about generative AI?
Oh, not for now. I mean,
Okay.
we could
Yeah.
all talk endlessly about it, but I'll leave it for now. That's super informative. Thanks for those answers. Yeah.
So, Brianna, you're in Saskatoon, right?
That's correct. Yep.
And so when you're taking on these projects, do you work on your own? Do you work with other colleagues? Tell us about that.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, it really depends on the project. Sometimes it's really more, just myself and me sort of working with someone to figure it out. But I also have, like folks that I've worked with, junior analysts, people who with expertise in, for example, or architecture, system architecture, people with expertise in areas that are sort of adjacent to the things that I do. And then, it's nice to be able to bring in those high level experts that can kind of consult on those areas of the project. So it really depends on the scope of the work, what kind of expertise is needed.
Super.
So it does seem like every time we turn around, things are just accelerating in this space. And so I'm going to ask you this. I'm going to ask you, what do you think is going to happen in the next year? And that doesn't seem like a lot of time, but it could represent a lot of time right now. And in particular, we do a lot of work. We're digital advisors for the Canadian Digital Advisory Program. And so we're working with small and medium-sized enterprises. And what do you think, sort of, not just maybe what might happen in the next year in general, but what do you see as opportunities for that group in the next upcoming year or so?
Mm-hmm. I think that especially ChatGPT, being able to use it really well and understanding how you can use it to save yourself time and what it can't do will be important for everyone, right? So being able to understand ways that you can incorporate it into your workflow, I think will be extremely, right? Because especially with some of these AI tools, it's a different way of working than if you're doing it sort of on your own. So if you're writing, for example, the actual process you go through to get, an article written, let's say, right, is very different than, using ChatGPT, right? So in some ways there are similarities, but where you spend your time changes dramatically depending on if you're using ChatGPT versus if you're doing it sort of the analog, I guess, way. And so I would say what's going to happen is the people that learn to use these tools really well are just going to accelerate quickly beyond the people that haven't taken the time to learn how to use them. So my advice would be spend the time, try it out, see how it works, get good at it, because it's not going to go away.
Yeah,
Good advice.
I've seen some studies pointing around like, what difference it makes to workers. And for lower performing ones, as a tool, it can bring them up to being an average performer. And if you're already a strong performer, it can make you an exceptional one. So it's
I love that. Yeah.
and it's free. Well, for now. Anything else that you wanted to share about some of the work you're doing or things that you'd like people to know about you?
Well, I mean, I am a big fan of like this generative AI space. I think that it was just before COVID. I did a keynote in 2020 in March, I don't know, 9th or something, I forget. And right before everything shut down, was the last in-person conference that I, went to for like 3 years, right? And one of the things that I said in that keynote was how important generative AI might be sometime in the future, because that was just when they had that site, this person does not exist. And you could see like the AI
Yes.
And what's interesting about where we were at that time to where we are now is that then it was like super niche, right? You had to kind of really be a tech person. You had to know how to write code to be able to use any of these things. You had to wade through these like really dense papers that had all this. It was difficult, right? And so now that it's easy, I am expecting an enormous boon of like creativity, of people being able to do things that they never before thought possible. People creating apps on their own when they don't, they have no coding background, but they know what they want, right? And so I think it's a huge, huge game changer, and I'm excited to see what's going to happen.
Super. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time. And if people want to connect with you, is it through LinkedIn? Is that the easiest thing?
Yep, that's perfect.
Super. Well, thanks very much. And I really enjoyed talking to you.
It's been
Yeah,
great
you're
talking
very
to you.
welcome.